Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into something really significant today, a type of crime that often flies under the radar compared to, street crime. But the impact, it can be way more damaging, more systematic, and honestly, just vastly more costly to society. We're talking about enterprise crime.
That's right. And enterprise crime is the perfect term, actually, because it signals we're not just looking at random, isolated acts. It's this big umbrella term covering three areas that are, well, fundamentally connected. They overlap quite a bit.
Yeah.
We're looking at white-collar crime, green crime, and transnational organized crime.
Yeah, that overlap is crucial, isn't it? If you just think of them as separate boxes, you miss the whole picture. Because the sources we looked at are really clear. In the real world, these things constantly merge and feed off each other. It's like this multi-headed beast of illegality.
Exactly. Think about it this way. You might have corporate executives, right? People under huge pressure to boost profits, maybe boost their own careers. So they make a decision, cut corners on waste disposal, ignore an environmental reg, and boom, that's a massive environmental crime. So you've got a white-collar motive advancing their position, directly causing a green crime. They're using their legitimate high-status position to cause incredible harm.
And it works the other way too, right? Like groups involved in illegal logging, for instance. They aren't just guys with chainsaws in the woods. They often set up these really complex corporate structures, front companies, shell corporations, all very white-collar tactics.
Precisely. They're using corrupt business practices to hide what they're doing. So the green criminal is essentially borrowing from the white-collar playbook to destroy ecosystems.
And then you layer on top the global dimension, transnational organized crime, or TOC. These groups make trillions globally from drugs, trafficking, you name it, and all that cash. It needs washing.
And that's where the overlap becomes almost total. TOC groups routinely buy legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, real estate, anything. They buy them specifically to launder money. So now you have criminal networks financing, sometimes even controlling parts of the regular economy.
So our mission for this deep dive is really to follow those connections. We need to sort through all the different definitions, the ways these crimes show up, from, that basic betrayal of trust in a boardroom to big philosophical questions about what even counts as environmental harm, all the way to these global networks that are basically weaponizing globalization. We've got to grasp the real scale and complexity here, not just treat them as separate issues.
It's about seeing the system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Recognizing the systemic nature of the threat these interconnected crimes pose.
Okay, so if we're talking enterprise crime, the absolute starting point, the foundation really, has to be white-collar crime. It's a concept most people have heard of, but maybe don't realize it wasn't always recognized legally or socially. It's relatively new in the grand scheme of things.
That's absolutely right. The term itself was properly defined, really brought into the academic and public consciousness by the American criminologist Edwin Sutherland. This was back in the 1930s. And his work was, well, revolutionary at the time. It completely challenged the idea that crime was just something done by the poor or the lower classes. Yeah. He basically forced everyone, sociologists, the legal system, to look at crimes committed by people society didn't think of as criminals, people with status.
And Sutherland's definition, it's still the gold standard, isn't it? It's so precise. He defined it as a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation.
Yes, and that definition is just brilliant in its simplicity and power. It does two crucial things at once. First, it identifies the person of respectability and high social status. And second, the context it has to be committed in the course of their occupation. This isn't about them shoplifting on the weekend.
Yeah.
And that immediately throws the spotlight on the core issue. It's a fundamental breach of trust. It's not just theft, it's abusing the power and position society gave them. That's the essence of what he called elite deviance.
Yeah, that occupational context is key. And while that definition holds up, the ways white-collar crime manifests, well, they've exploded since the 30s. When people think crime, they picture burglaries, muggings, the stuff on the news. But the actual extent of white-collar crime, it's staggering, partly because it's so often hidden, unreported.
We should probably put some numbers on that, because the scale can be quite shocking when you see it laid out. The sources we reviewed indicate that something like 24%, nearly 1 in 4 U.S. households, reported experiencing at least one form of white-collar crime in the previous year alone. And for individuals, it was around 17%.
Wait, hold on. Did you say 24% of households? Nearly a quarter. That's not some fringe activity. That's deeply embedded in everyday economic life. It's an epidemic, really. So what are the most common forms people actually experience and report? What does this look like on the ground?
It's often the kind of stuff that feels like small nicks, but they add up across the population to enormous damage. The most frequently reported things were credit card fraud, unauthorized charges, that kind of thing. Also, price misrepresentation, being charged more than what was advertised. And interestingly, unnecessary repairs. Think about car mechanics inventing problems or plumbers charging for work that didn't need doing. These hit people directly in the wallet.
Okay, so it's prevalent, incredibly common. But here's the kicker, right? That massive 24% number exists alongside this huge reporting gap. The sources say only about 12%, just 12 of these crimes, ever got reported to police or any kind of crime control agency.
Exactly. That gap is massive.
So if people are experiencing it at that rate but not reporting it, the true scale must be astronomically larger than any official crime stats show.
Well, the underreporting makes sense, even if it's a huge problem for actually tackling the issue.
Yeah.
Think about it. These crimes can be complex. Sometimes the victim doesn't even realize they've been ripped off until much later. And even if they do realize it, maybe they feel reporting it is pointless. Like, it's too hard to prove, law enforcement has bigger fish to fry, or the system just isn't set up to handle this kind of sophisticated financial stuff compared to, say, a robbery.
Yeah, a feeling of helplessness maybe, or embarrassment even. Okay, so to really get a handle on this threat, we need to break it down, right? Move beyond just white-collar crime as one big blob. It's not a single crime type. It's like a whole ecosystem of deception and financial manipulation.
Absolutely. We can start with maybe the most dramatic ones, white-collar swindles. These are usually big, often one-time scams, and they frequently target vulnerable people looking for financial security or maybe desperate for a quick fix or easy money. These are the frauds that sometimes make headlines.
And the sources bring up a really painful example here, tied to the 2008 financial crisis. Subprime mortgage swindles. This wasn't just, bad business decisions. It involved predatory lending on a massive scale.
Exactly. Financial institutions knowingly push these incredibly complex, high-risk loans onto people who couldn't possibly afford them, often hiding or misrepresenting the real terms. It was systemic deception.
And then, like vulture circling, after the crash, you saw the rise of foreclosure rescue scams.
Right. Fraudulent operators swooping in, preying on people already losing their homes. They'd promise miracles, charge huge fees up front for services they had no intention of providing. Just pure exploitation of desperation.
And there are other kinds too, right? Like using religion.
Yes, things like religious swindles, where fraudsters leverage faith and community trust just to extract money. Swindles are fundamentally about grand deception built on lies and false promises.
Okay, so those are the big, splashy swindles. But then there's something maybe more pervasive, more constant. The sources call it white-collar chiseling. This sounds like something different, like regularly cheating people or organizations through deceit, maybe over a longer period.
That's exactly it. Chiseling isn't the big one-off scam. It's the slow, steady bleed. It's about abusing an ongoing relationship or position for small, repeated gains that add up. And we can even break chiseling down further. There's professional chiseling. This is where high-status professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants use their position of trust to cheat their own clients or patients.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, think of a lawyer padding their billable hours, charging for time they didn't work.
Yeah.
Or in healthcare, a doctor ordering unnecessary tests or procedures, maybe getting kickbacks, just to generate more revenue. It exploits the knowledge gap between the professional and the client.
Gotcha. And then there's chiseling in the financial world.
Yes, securities chiseling, this is huge. It covers all sorts of deceptive practices in the financial markets that are specifically illegal under federal law. We're talking insider trading using non-public information for profit, or pump and dump schemes where fraudsters artificially inflate a stock's price and sell out, leaving others with worthless shares. Market manipulation that harms regular investors. It's about systematically rigging the game.
Okay, swindles, chiseling. What else falls under this umbrella?
Well, there's a specific type called white-collar exploitation. This one's interesting. It captures a particular abuse of power within an organization or bureaucracy. It's when someone uses their official position to basically force people to pay them for services that those people are already supposed to receive by right.
So it's like demanding a bribe just to do your job, like a government clerk demanding extra cash to process a permit that should be free or have a standard fee.
Precisely. It's like setting up your own personal toll booth inside the system. You're leveraging someone's need, maybe they need a license quickly or need a file moved against the service they're already entitled to. It's exploiting bureaucratic power for personal gain.
Okay, so we've covered deception, systematic cheating, exploitation. Now let's talk about selling access, selling power. The sources call this white-collar influence peddling. This sounds like people monetizing their positions, right? Selling their influence or information that they only have because of their job.
Exactly. And this is incredibly corrosive to any system, public or private. It undermines fairness and the rule of law. In the criminal justice system, for example, it could be a judge taking a bribe to sway a verdict, or a police officer tipping someone off, or a prison guard smuggling contraband. It completely compromises the integrity of justice.
And in the business world, it must be rampant there too.
Absolutely. Think about a purchasing manager demanding a kickback from a supplier just to give them the contract. That company should be chosen on merit, price, quality.
Yeah.
Not because they slipped the manager some cash. It's a clear abuse of their duty to their employer.
The sources give a really great kind of specific example of this, payola. Can you unpack that? Because it seems like something that was maybe seen as just how things were done for a while.
Payola is a perfect case study. It was this routine, almost institutionalized practice, mainly in the record industry back in the day. Record companies would literally pay radio stations or specific DJs under the table to play their songs more often.
So basically buying airtime disguised as legitimate programming.
Exactly. And it's such a good example of influence peddling because, like you said, many involved probably didn't see it as a serious crime, maybe just aggressive promotion, but it totally corrupted the system. Airplay is supposed to reflect listener demand, or maybe a DJ's taste, or a song's quality. Payola turned it into a commodity. It meant the songs you heard weren't necessarily the best or most popular, they were the ones backed by secret payments. It distorted the whole cultural marketplace for music. Who got famous was partly determined by bribes.
Okay, so beyond selling influence, let's get into straight-up theft, but theft within the organization. We need to distinguish different types here.
Right. First, let's talk about theft by employees. The classic example is embezzlement or general employee fraud. This is where someone uses their position, maybe they're a bookkeeper, a cashier, a manager with access to accounts to systematically steal company funds or take company property for themselves. They manipulate the books to cover their tracks.
It's theft enabled by their access and trust, right? And is this different from just like employees stealing office supplies?
Well, yeah, although that's also a problem. The sources mention blue-collar pilferage,
Yeah.
which is that kind of systematic, maybe low-level theft of company property by employees. Tools, supplies, small items. It might seem minor individually, but cumulatively, it can cost companies a lot. It's still theft, regardless of the employee's status.
Okay, so that's theft from lower or mid-levels. What about theft from the very top?
That's management fraud. This is when senior executives, the leadership, convert company assets for their own personal benefit. This is often much more complex than simple embezzlement. It might involve manipulating financial statements to inflate bonuses, misrepresenting company performance to boost stock options, or awarding themselves outrageous hidden perks that effectively steal from shareholders and damage the company's financial health. It's looting from the top.
So we've covered internal theft. What about theft against the organization, but by outsiders, by customers or clients?
Ah, yes, that's client fraud. This is basically theft committed by an economic client from an organization that provides them with credit or reimburses them for services. The user is scamming the system that's supposed to serve them.
Okay, this sounds like a huge category. What falls under this?
It is massive. Think about healthcare fraud. Individuals filing false insurance claims for treatments they never got, or doctors billing for ghost patients. That's client fraud against insurers or government programs like Medicare, Medicaid. It also includes bank fraud lying on loan applications, check kiting schemes, and of course, the big one, tax evasion. Individuals or corporations deliberately hiding income or inventing deductions to avoid paying the taxes they legally owe. That's client fraud against the government. Client fraud drains resources from essential systems.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on individuals, executives, employees, clients abusing their positions or relationships. But white-collar crime gets even bigger, doesn't it? When the criminal actor isn't just a person, but the corporation itself. This is corporate crime, sometimes called organizational crime.
Yes, and this is arguably the most powerful and potentially harmful form of enterprise crime. Because now you have the resources, the legal shield, and the influence of a major institution behind the criminal activity. The definition here is key. Corporate crime occurs when powerful institutions, or their representatives acting on the institution's behalf, willfully violate laws. And these are laws specifically designed to either stop them from causing social harm or to require them to actively do social good. It's not just a rogue employee acting alone, it's a deliberate, calculated organizational choice or policy.
And the examples given really show how fundamental these crimes are. They hit the economy, public safety, things like illegal restraint of trade, that's like price fixing, right? Where supposed competitors secretly agree not to compete on price, forcing consumers to pay more.
Exactly. Antitrust violations. Or deceptive pricing strategies, false advertising making completely untrue claims about a product. And crucially, systematic worker safety violations. When a company knowingly cuts corners on safety measures, maybe inadequate equipment, poor training, exposure to toxins just to save money, and workers get injured or killed as a result. That's corporate crime. It's an organizational decision that explicitly values profit over the health and lives of its employees. Calculated harm on an institutional level.
So, given how complex this all is, how high status the perpetrators often are, and the sheer resources involved, especially with corporate crime, controlling it must be really different from policing street crime. It needs different tools, different approaches.
Absolutely. You need specialized regulatory and legal muscle. In the United States, the main source of federal authority to regulate these kinds of activities comes from the Commerce Clause of the Constitution.
How does that work?
Well, the Commerce Clause gives the federal government the power to regulate trade and commerce that happens between states or affects the national economy. Since almost all significant white-collar and corporate crimes, securities fraud, price fixing, environmental dumping that crosses state lines impact interstate commerce, this clause gives Washington the power to step in. Often state-level enforcement isn't enough or can't handle the scale.
Okay, so the feds have the authority, but who actually does the detective work? It's not usually beat cops, right?
No, generally not. The primary detection work falls to specialized administrative agencies. Think the SEC for securities fraud, the EPA for environmental crimes, the FTC for unfair trade practices. These agencies have the deep technical expertise in finance, environmental science, trade law needed to actually spot the violations, which can be incredibly complex and hidden within legitimate business operations.
And when it comes to actually controlling these organizations, stopping the bad behavior, what are the main strategies? The sources mention two different approaches.
Right, enforcement tends to rely on two broad philosophical strategies, and they have different goals. You really need both. They are compliance strategies and deterrence strategies.
Okay, what's the difference? Compliance sounds softer.
It is, generally. Compliance strategies are more proactive, more cooperative in a sense. The goal is to get organizations to conform to the law without necessarily having to detect every violation and punish every individual offender. It's about encouraging good behavior from the inside. Think mandatory ethics training, strong internal audits, whistleblower protections, clear corporate policies, maybe industry self-regulation. The idea is to build systems that prevent the crime from happening in the first place, assuming the company wants to comply if shown how.
Okay, so compliance is about prevention and internal controls. What about deterrence? That sounds more like punishment.
Exactly. Deterrence strategies are reactive and punitive. They kick in after a violation has occurred. This involves actively detecting violations, investigating to determine who was responsible, individuals and the corporation, and then hitting them with significant penalties. We're talking heavy fines, forcing restitution, criminal indictments leading to jail time for executives, sometimes even dissolving the corporation. The explicit goal here is to make the pain of punishment so severe that it deters that offender, and others watching, from committing similar crimes in the future. Make the cost far exceed any potential profit.
So effectively controlling white-collar crime means finding the right balance between these two.
It's a constant balancing act. Rely too heavily on just compliance, and maybe cynical companies just see it as box-ticking, easily circumvented. Rely only on harsh deterrence after the fact, and you might create a climate of fear that stifles legitimate business. Plus, the harm has already been done. You need that sophisticated mix. It's a perpetual regulatory challenge.
That idea of balancing regulation and harm gives us a really good bridge to our next area. We're shifting from financial harm, boardroom betrayals, to damage done to the environment itself. We're moving into green crime.
Right, and green crime really broadens our whole concept of victim and harm. It moves beyond just direct, immediate human victims, although humans are ultimately affected. It forces us to recognize the environment itself, ecosystems, species, natural resources, as something that can be criminally harmed. And of course, damage to the planet inevitably comes back to harm people, often disproportionately.
So at its core, what defines green crime? The sources say it covers a whole range of actions and their outcomes that damage the environment. And it stems from, well, basic economic decisions.
Fundamentally, yes. It often comes down to decisions about what gets produced. Is it inherently polluting? Where it's produced? Are factories sited near vulnerable communities? And crucially, how it's produced. Are corners being cut on safety and disposal?
There's a key insight in the sources here, kind of chilling actually. It says environmental destruction, these green crimes, often happen when the focus on safety or environmental protection gets pushed aside by other things.
That's the critical point. When attention to safety or the cost of proper environmental controls is outweighed by other considerations, usually the drive for profit, or maybe just speed and expediency, or avoiding the hassle and cost of doing things the right way, that's when you get disasters.
It's almost like the system is set up to prioritize profit over the planet unless there's strong enforcement.
In many cases, yes. If a company faces a choice between spending, say, $5 million on proper legal toxic waste disposal versus paying someone $50,000 to just dump it illegally in a remote area, and they think the risk of getting caught is low, the financial incentive to commit the green crime can be overwhelming. That short-term gain leads to long-term, sometimes irreversible, damage.
Okay, but defining what actually counts as an environmental crime seems tricky. It's not like defining robbery, where everyone agrees on the basics. The sources point out there isn't one single, universally accepted definition. Instead, there are at least 3 different viewpoints based on quite different philosophical ideas. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It really does. Let's start with the narrowest perspective, the one that aligns most closely with traditional law and criminology. That's the legalist view. From this standpoint, environmental crimes are only those actions that specifically violate existing criminal laws, statutes passed explicitly to protect people or the environment. It's strictly about what's written in the law books.
So, under the legalist view, if a company polluted a river for years, but there wasn't a specific law against dumping that particular chemical at that time, it wouldn't be considered a crime, even if it caused massive harm.
Correct. If it wasn't explicitly illegal according to a statute, the legalist view wouldn't label it a crime. It's a very black and white, statute-focused approach.
Okay, but that narrowness is exactly what the next view objects to, right? The environmental justice view.
Exactly. The environmental justice perspective argues that just limiting environmental crimes to what's currently illegal is far too narrow and misses the bigger picture of social harm. This view puts a heavy emphasis on equity.
Why equity? How does that connect to environmental crime?
Because environmental harm rarely affects everyone equally. The environmental justice view highlights the well-documented fact that things like toxic waste dumps, polluting factories, lack of regulatory enforcement, these tend to be concentrated in low-income communities and communities of color. So this view argues that if an action causes significant disproportionate harm to a particular group's health, environment, and livelihood, even if the specific law is weak or maybe not perfectly applicable, it should still be recognized as a crime against those people. It focuses on the disparate impact.
That makes sense. It shifts the focus from just the legal text to the actual lived social consequences.
Right.
Okay, so legalist environmental justice. What's the third view? It sounds like the broadest one.
It is. It's the biocentric view. This perspective takes a radical step further by shifting the moral center away from humans altogether. In the biocentric view, environmental harm isn't defined by human laws or even human equity. It's defined as any human activity that significantly disrupts a natural ecosystem, leading to the destruction of plant and animal life or damaging the stability of that system.
Whoa. So under the biocentric view, the victim of the crime isn't the person who gets sick from pollution or the government agency whose rules were broken. The victim is the ecosystem itself, the forest, the river, the species being wiped out.
Precisely. That's the fundamental philosophical leap. The legalist asks, is there a law against it? The environmental justice advocate asks, does it disproportionately harm a human community? The biocentric advocate asks, has this human action damaged the health and integrity of the natural world? These aren't just academic differences. They lead to very different ideas about what should be illegal, how seriously we should take certain actions, and who should be held accountable.
And there's one more related idea mentioned, the harms perspective. How does that fit in?
The harms perspective is a broader criminological idea that touches on this. It argues that the very definition of crime is a social construct. Society decides what counts as criminal. Given the potentially catastrophic nature of environmental damage, this perspective argues we should expand our definition of crime to include all serious social harms, including environmental ones, whether or not a specific criminal statute happens to exist for it at this moment. It's basically saying the law needs to catch up to the reality and severity of the harm being done.
Okay, so regardless of which definition you prefer, the narrow legal one or the broad biocentric one, the actual forms green crime takes are pretty concrete and destructive. The sources list several major categories that paint a grim picture.
They do. You have crimes targeting plant life, most notably illegal logging.
Yeah.
And this isn't just, someone cutting down a tree on their property line. This is often large-scale, organized destruction of protected forests, sometimes ancient forests.
Yeah.
It drives deforestation, habitat loss, climate change, and often involves corruption, fraud, and violence to get access to the timber.
Then there are crimes against animals, illegal wildlife exports, the global black market in endangered species, animal parts like ivory or rhino horn, exotic pets. It's a massive illegal trade.
And it's not just cruel, it's pushing countless species towards extinction. It's driven purely by profit and demand, often facilitated by organized crime networks.
And in the water.
In the water, you have illegal fishing, often called IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated. This involves fishing fleets operating outside the law, ignoring quotas, fishing in protected zones, using destructive methods like bottom trawling that wreck marine habitats. It devastates fish stocks that millions rely on for food and livelihoods. And it often uses fraudulent documents or flags of convenience to hide its activities.
And then perhaps the most direct threat, certainly to human health in many cases, is just the sheer scale of illegal dumping and illegal polluting.
Absolutely. This covers everything from factories deliberately discharging toxic chemicals into rivers or the air to avoid treatment costs, all the way to the global trade in hazardous waste, especially e-waste. Wealthier countries often ship mountains of old computers, phones, batteries to developing nations where environmental laws are weaker. It gets dismantled unsafely, poisoning workers and leaching heavy metals into the soil and water.
And this dumping often involves those white-collar techniques we talked about earlier, doesn't it? Like shell companies.
Perfect example of the overlap. Waste brokers use complex corporate structures, shell companies, false paperwork, classic white-collar fraud tactics to obscure where the hazardous waste came from and make it almost impossible to track who is ultimately responsible when it ends up poisoning a community dump site somewhere.
Okay, so how do we fight this? The legal framework must be key. The sources say most countries, including the U.S., do have laws against pollution and environmental damage.
Yes, passing the laws is the first essential step. Most industrialized nations, and many developing ones, have significant environmental legislation on the books, making it a crime to pollute or damage natural resources. But, as we know, a law without enforcement is just words on paper.
So who enforces these laws in the U.S.?
The primary federal enforcement agency is the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. A crucial moment was back in 1988 when the EPA was given full law enforcement authority. That was a big deal. It signaled a shift, treating serious environmental violations not just as things requiring a fine, a civil penalty, but as actual crimes that could be investigated and prosecuted, potentially leading to jail time.
But as you mentioned earlier with environmental justice, official enforcement doesn't always reach everywhere or might not prioritize certain areas. Is that where citizens come in?
Absolutely. The role of citizen groups is incredibly important in controlling green crime. Environmental activists, local community groups, national nonprofits, they are often on the front lines. They do crucial work, monitoring pollution levels, collecting evidence of illegal dumping, bringing lawsuits, lobbying for stronger laws, and raising public awareness. They often step into the gap when official enforcement seems lacking or slow.
Why is their role so vital? Is it just about extra manpower?
It's more than that. The sources suggest, and reality often shows, that official law enforcement and regulatory attention can sometimes be, well, stratified. It might depend on the political influence or socioeconomic status of the affected community. Wealthier communities might see swift action on an environmental threat, while poorer or minority communities might struggle to get authorities to take their complaints seriously. So those citizen groups provide a voice and a means of action for communities that might otherwise be ignored. Their grassroots activism is essential for achieving environmental equity.
Okay, we've looked at crimes rooted in corporate structures and elite positions, and crimes focused on environmental harm. Now we pivot to the third major pillar of enterprise crime, the globally networked operations. Transnational organized crime, or TOC?
Right. Now, organized crime itself isn't new, obviously. It has a very long history, arguably tracing back centuries in various forms. When most Americans hear organized crime, their minds probably jump to the mafia, La Cosa Nostra. And yes, the mafia is still around, Our sources estimate maybe 25,000 actual members in the U.S., plus maybe 250,000 affiliates worldwide, so they still exist. But the traditional U.S. mafia is generally seen as being in decline compared to its peak power.
What caused that decline here in the U.S.?
Two main things, really. First, very successful, high-profile federal prosecutions, especially using tools like the IRCO Act, which we'll get to. These decapitated leadership and disrupted operations significantly. And second, just demographics. A lot of the powerful old-school bosses aged, died, or went to prison for life, leading to internal power struggles and fragmentation. It created something of a vacuum in the underworld.
And nature abhors a vacuum, right? Especially the criminal underworld. So what filled that space?
What emerged, and what now dominates the global landscape, is a much more diverse, adaptable, and truly international structure. Transnational organized crime, POC. The key is in the name, transnational. These are organized criminal enterprises that operate across national borders, leveraging globalization. What makes TOC so incredibly powerful, financially speaking, is where its money comes from. The income is generated almost entirely from supplying illegal goods and services that are in high demand globally. It's a diversified portfolio of illicit activities.
And the list of activities is pretty grim, isn't it? It reads like a catalog of global problems.
It really does. Core activities include massive narcotics distribution networks spanning continents, the horrific trade in sex slaves and human trafficking, illicit arms dealing, fueling conflicts, and the vast online and offline market for illegal pornography.
But it's not just those huge global trades, right? They still do the older stuff, too.
Oh yes, TOC groups are often involved in more traditional rackets like extortion, running illegal gambling operations, and sophisticated cargo theft rings, targeting valuable goods moving through international supply chains. They adapt to opportunities.
And a crucial difference from the old mafia is how they use technology, isn't it?
Absolutely critical. Modern TOC groups are incredibly tech-savvy.
Yeah.
They use cyberspace constantly, encrypted communications to coordinate globally, the dark web to market illegal goods, online platforms to promote sexual exploitation, sophisticated cybercrime tools for fraud and money laundering. Technology makes their operations faster, harder to trace, and truly borderless in a way the old bosses couldn't have imagined. And this global reach, this transnational nature, isn't just limited to the big, sophisticated syndicates that resemble multinational corporations. We're also seeing it at the gang level. The sources point out how some criminal gangs that started locally, maybe as street gangs in one city, have expanded massively, first becoming national mega gangs.
And then going international.
Exactly. We now see truly international gangs, with networks spanning Asia, Eastern Europe, North America, Latin America. They form alliances, set up chapters in different countries.
What allows these gangs, which maybe started small, to grow so powerful internationally? What's the key factor?
The crucial context, the fertile ground for these groups to flourish, is often governmental weakness. TOC, including these transnational gangs, tends to thrive in countries where the government is too weak, too corrupt, too unstable, or just lacks the resources to effectively police its own territory and borders. When the state can't provide security or enforce laws, organized crime often steps into that power vacuum. They can become like a parallel state in some regions, controlling territory, taxing populations.
And then the very things that make the legitimate global economy work easy, travel, trade, finance, they exploit those too.
Precisely. Legitimate globalization has inadvertently created the perfect infrastructure for TOC. Easier international travel lets members move around. Global trade systems provide cover for smuggling goods. And near-instantaneous international financial transactions, especially using cryptocurrencies or shell companies, make it easier to move and launder money. These factors allow them to set up operations far from their home base, target richer markets in more prosperous countries, and build resilient global networks.
So they basically see the whole world as their potential marketplace and operating base, using the legitimate world's tools against it.
That's a very good way to put it. They exploit the seams and efficiencies of the globalized system for illicit profit.
Okay, so fighting something this big, this global, this sophisticated, it must be incredibly challenging. Who takes the lead on controlling TOC?
Given the scale and international nature, enforcement primarily falls to federal agencies within nations, agencies with national jurisdiction and international reach. In the U.S., think the FBI, the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, the Treasury Department for financial tracking.
But since the crime crosses borders, one country acting alone can't possibly solve it, right? International cooperation must be essential.
Non-negotiable. It's absolutely essential. Because the criminals operate globally, The police and prosecutors have to cooperate globally, too. The sources mention specific examples of international task forces and working groups designed to facilitate this. Things like the Eurasian Organized Crime Working Group, the Central European Working Group, the Southeast European Cooperative Initiative, SECI. These aren't just talk shops. They are vital platforms for law enforcement agencies from different countries to share intelligence, track suspects' money across borders, coordinate investigations, and arrange extraditions. It's about building trust and operational links.
So international cooperation is key. What about legal tools? Are there specific laws designed to target these complex organizations? You mentioned RICO earlier.
Yes, the ICO Act is arguably the single most powerful legal tool the U.S. has for combating organized crime, including TOC when it impacts the U.S.
RICO stands for Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. What makes it so special? How is it different from just charging someone with, say, drug trafficking or murder?
RICO was a game changer because it allows prosecutors to look beyond just individual crimes. Instead of just charging one gangster for one murder or one instance of extortion, RICO lets prosecutors charge individuals for being part of a larger criminal enterprise that engages in a pattern of criminal activity over time. This pattern of racketeering activity can include a wide range of underlying federal and state crimes: murder, kidnapping, bribery, extortion, fraud, drug trafficking, money laundering. The key is proving the pattern and the connection to the criminal enterprise. This allows prosecutors to target the entire organization, including the leaders who might insulate themselves from committing the crimes directly, and dismantle the whole structure, not just take out low-level players.
And doesn't RICO also have some really powerful financial penalties?
Yeah.
Hitting them more it hurts.
Absolutely. That's one of its greatest strengths against profit-driven organizations like TOC. RICO has both criminal and civil provisions. On the civil side, victims of racketeering activity, including the government sometimes, can sue the organization and its members. And if they win, they're entitled to treble damages 3 times the amount of their actual financial losses. That's a huge deterrent.
Wow, triple damages.
But perhaps even more devastating is asset forfeiture. RICO allows the government, upon conviction, to seize all assets, property, money, businesses that were derived from or used to facilitate the pattern of racketeering activity. So they can take the drug money, the cars, the houses, the front companies, the bank accounts, everything connected to the criminal enterprise. Since TOC is all about making money, taking away their assets is often the most effective way to cripple and ultimately destroy the organization.
Okay, so we've mapped out the terrain. The white-collar boardroom betrayals, the green crimes against the planet, the vast networks of transnational organized crime. We see the what and the how. But now we need to ask the really fundamental question: why? What actually drives these individuals, often people with status or calculated criminal leaders, to commit these kinds of acts? What are the underlying causes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Criminologists propose several different theories to explain the motivations behind enterprise crime. We can start with maybe the most straightforward economic model, rational choice theory. In this context, rational choice theory often boils down the motivation to a conflict, or maybe a spectrum, between two powerful drivers: greed versus need.
Okay, let's take greed first. This sounds pretty straightforward.
It is, on the surface. This perspective argues that some people are simply greedy. They see an opportunity to acquire significant wealth through illegal means, maybe corporate fraud, maybe insider trading, maybe trafficking, and they make a rational calculation. They weigh the potential massive profits against the perceived risk and severity of punishment if they get caught. And if they believe the potential payoff is high enough and the risk of serious consequences seems low enough, they rationally choose the criminal shortcut to wealth.
So it's a cold, calculated business decision, just an illegal one. The potential reward justifies the risk in their minds.
Essentially, yes. For the purely greedy actor, the chance to make, say, $1 billion through fraud might make the risk of maybe a few years in a relatively comfortable prison seem like an acceptable occupational hazard.
Okay, that's greed. What about the other side? Need. How does that drive enterprise crime? This seems different from just wanting to be super rich.
Right. The need perspective suggests that some individuals turn to white-collar crime, or maybe even lower-level involvement in organized crime, not out of pure avarice, but because they feel driven by some overwhelming financial or perhaps psychological necessity.
What kind of necessity?
Well, think about a business owner facing imminent bankruptcy who commits fraud to keep the company afloat, or an executive under immense pressure to meet unrealistic profit targets set by the board who cooks the books to avoid getting fired. Or maybe someone with a serious gambling addiction who embezzles funds to cover their debts. Or someone feeling a desperate psychological need to maintain a certain lifestyle or social status they can no longer afford legitimately. In these cases, the crime isn't necessarily about becoming fabulously wealthy. It's perceived as a way to solve an immediate, pressing problem or avoid a catastrophic personal failure. It's driven by desperation rather than ambition.
Okay, greed or need provides a motive. But
Yeah.
here's something I find really fascinating. Many of these white-collar offenders, especially, they maintain respectable lives, high status, they see themselves as good people. Pure rational calculation doesn't seem to fully explain how they live with themselves. There must be this kind of mental gymnastics involved, right? This brings us to the rationalization neutralization view.
This is a crucial perspective, I agree, because it acknowledges that most people, even criminals, have been socialized with conventional values. They generally know right from wrong. So this theory suggests that before or while committing their crimes, offenders develop these justifications, these rationalizations for their behavior. They use these techniques of neutralization, as Sykes and Matza call them, to silence their own conscience, to resolve the internal conflict they feel about doing something they know is illegal or unethical. It allows them to proceed with the crime without destroying their self-image as a decent person.
And the sources highlight one specific technique that seems really common in the corporate world: denying the victim. How does that work?
Denying the victim is a powerful neutralization. Corporate offenders, especially when their crime targets another business, an abstract entity like the market, or a large, impersonal organization like an insurance company or the government, think tax evasion, they often frame it in a way that suggests there isn't a real, identifiable victim who is truly harmed. Or, if there is a victim, maybe they argue the victim deserved it somehow. They were foolish, they should have known the risks, it's just the way business is done.
So they tell themselves, I'm not really hurting anyone important, or this is just a game between businesses, not real harm.
Exactly. By minimizing or denying the victim's suffering or legitimacy, they neutralize the moral wrongness of the act in their own minds. They can see themselves not as criminals harming people, but as savvy players in a competitive game. It's not personal, it's just a business, that kind of thinking. It allows them to maintain their respectable facade, both to the world and to themselves.
It's like extreme compartmentalization, keeping the illegal act separate from their identity as a pillar of the community. Okay, rational choice and rationalization focus a lot on the individual's thinking. What about broader factors? The environment. The sources mention a cultural view. This suggests the problem might not just be individual deviance, but the culture of the organization itself.
Precisely. The cultural view shifts the focus. It proposes that some business organizations, or even entire industries, might actually promote and reward white-collar criminality. The corporate culture itself, the shared values, the norms of behavior, what gets you promoted, what gets you fired, might implicitly or even explicitly encourage cutting corners, bending rules, or engaging in outright illegal acts to achieve success. Think of environments where win at all costs is the mantra.
So this challenges the whole bad apple idea, right? It suggests the barrel itself might be rotten,
Right.
that the organization is criminogenic, it breeds crime.
Exactly. It draws a parallel, suggesting that just as certain lower-class subcultures might sometimes normalize street crime as a survival tactic or path to status, some corporate cultures might normalize white-collar crime as a path to profit and promotion. The pressure to conform to the criminal norms within that specific culture can be immense.
Okay, that's the cultural environment. What about inherent individual traits? There's one more theory, the self-control view. This one sounds a bit counterintuitive for white-collar criminals.
It does, because we often picture white-collar criminals as highly disciplined, long-term planners. But the self-control view, developed by Gottfredson and Hershey, argues the opposite. It proposes that all types of crime, including white-collar crime, stem from the individual having low self-control. People with low self-control tend to be impulsive, risk-taking, focused on immediate gratification, and less likely to consider the long-term consequences of their actions.
But how does that fit with complex financial fraud? That seems to require planning.
Well, the theory suggests that while the opportunity for crime might be complex, you need access to the financial system. The decision to commit the crime might still be impulsive. Maybe it's the sudden impulse to embezzle funds when an opportunity appears, or the impulsive decision to commit fraud to close a big deal right now, rather than doing the slow, hard work legitimately. They see a shortcut to immediate gain, money status. And lacking self-control, they take it without fully weighing the long-term risks of prison, disgrace, etc.
That's fascinating. So under this view, the underlying psychology of a white-collar criminal might not be that different from a street criminal who impulsively steals a car. The main difference is just the type of opportunity their environment presents.
That's the core argument of the self-control view. Low self-control plus opportunity equals crime. The opportunity looks different in a boardroom than on a street corner, but the underlying trait, the inability to delay gratification and consider consequences, might be the same. It suggests access and opportunity are bigger differentiators than some inherent criminal mastermind quality.
Wow. Okay, that really brings together the different facets, the types of crime, the structures, and now the potential psychological drivers. It paints a really comprehensive picture of this whole world of enterprise crime.
It does. And when you look at it all together, you see this vast, complex, interconnected system. Whether the initial spark is greed or perceived need, or maybe just poor impulse control combined with opportunity, the resulting harm is immense. We've traced it from impacting individual households, that shocking 24% statistic for white-collar victimization, all the way up to destabilizing global ecosystems through green crime, and even undermining governments and fueling violence through transnational organized crime. The scale is enormous, and the crimes are deeply systemic.
So thinking about our listeners, what are the key takeaways here? What does this all mean for you navigating the world today?
Well, I think it means recognizing that sometimes the biggest threats to fairness, trust, and even safety aren't the ones you see on the nightly news. They're happening in corporate filings, in hidden waste disposal sites, in encrypted online networks. It means understanding that powerful psychological tool rationalization, especially denying the victim, that allows these crimes to flourish even among people who seem respectable. And it means appreciating the difference between trying to control this through proactive compliance versus reactive deterrence.
And also engaging with those fundamental questions about green crime. What should count as a crime? Just breaking a law, causing unequal harm, or any major disruption to the natural world? That debate has real consequences. And finally, seeing how globalization isn't just about cheap goods, it's also a tool that sophisticated criminal networks expertly leverage for their own ends. Which brings us to our final, provocative thought for you to consider. We've seen this constant blurring of lines throughout our discussion. Think about it. If corporate executives use these neutralization techniques, like denying the victim, to psychologically justify billion-dollar frauds, and at the same time, transnational organized crime groups are buying up legitimate businesses using standard corporate structures to launder their illicit fortunes.
And how sharp is the line, really, between the mindset driving some legitimate enterprise and the mindset driving explicitly criminal enterprise? Could it be that the ability to rationalize harm, that capacity to engage in mental gymnastics to justify actions that benefit oneself while harming others or society, is actually the single most important shared characteristic? The common thread that links the slick corporate swindler, the illegal dumper, and the global traffickers, regardless of their methods or status, is that rationalization the core enabler of all enterprise crime? Something to think about.